here, much more gunfire going on right now. There is a developing situation. The protesters who have been calling on President Mubarak to step down, who are in the center of Tahrir Square, appear to be winning, if not have won, this incredible standoff here. I've been watching, just as we're talking in other areas, not being filmed by the camera, a man who was hit by a Molotov cocktail. He fell to the ground. He was on fire. The other supporters managed to put him out. The weapons are fairly common. They appear to be, and this tank is now creating what seems to be some sort of smoke screen to give people cover as it heads toward a different position, at least. This would be the first action we've seen all day of the army to try and intervene and prevent Egyptians from attacking other Egyptians as this situation is developed and involved much more gunfire than we've seen really throughout the course of the entire day.
Good morning. It's 8 o'clock on the East Coast. Welcome to Morning Joe, a live look at Washington, where President Obama is expected to speak within the hour at the National Prayer Breakfast.
That is a great event.
Yeah,
I mean, that brings
nice.
people together from all sides, and it's one of the special events of the entire year there.
And he is expected.
All presidents go there, congressmen, senators, ambassadors. It's really where official Washington comes together, and just civility.
It's a wonderful event.
It's wonderful.
Yeah. No event is more rewarding in Washington.
With us on set, the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, Richard Haass.
Where are we? Where do we stand?
Yesterday was a bad day. It took a decided turn for the worse in Egypt, and up to now there seemed to be a narrative. There seemed to be a narrative that the army was essentially allowing things to play out, and the army was implicitly siding with the demonstrators against the Mubarak government. Yesterday things switched, and the fact that those people came out in the street, on the horses, on the camels, the army stood there, it looked as if yesterday the army was beginning to switch sides and essentially backing Mubarak. All of which sets things up for tomorrow, Friday, when people come out of the mosques, which could be an extraordinarily violent and potentially even decisive day. But yesterday was a decided turn for the worse, and really surprising in some ways. I thought we had a narrative of political transition, and yesterday made me not at all sure that that's where things were heading.
What significance, if any, though, should we read into initial reports early this morning here that the Army is now moving their tanks in between the two different groups of people in the square, between the pro-Mubarak forces, which are much smaller than the people out there wanting Mubarak out?
If the army acts in ways that stops violence group on group, it's a good sign. But pretty soon the army's going to have to make, I think, a fateful decision. Because I don't believe the patience of the masses, if you will, is for this to play out until the fall. So sooner rather than later, Omar Suleiman and the Sami Anan and the leaders of the Egyptian army are going to really have to decide which way they want this to play out. Do they want there to be a transition sooner rather than later to some post-Mubarak government? Or essentially, are they going to allow the president of Egypt to have his druthers and stay on until the fall or possibly longer?
Yeah.
And I think in the next couple of days, the army's going to have to make a fateful decision for itself and its country.
Willie, when you wrote your landmark work on modern warfare, you coined a phrase. It's a situation that we have here, Mika. It's amazing. You said, and I quote, "Power abhors a vacuum."
Okay.
I think the most fascinating part of this story is there is a vacuum over there. Who is Mubarak's successor? We've got a vice president who was just appointed, but clearly does not have the will of the power. El Baradei, I'm sorry. I think he's this year's Chalabi. The Muslim Brotherhood is a shadow of what they are in other Arab countries. There is no clear successor, and I think that's why we see people wallowing around in the street, going from one side to another, trying to figure out what the future of Egypt is.
They know they want Mubarak out. They haven't gotten that far yet.
But that's typical. Almost all revolutions in phase one know what they're against.
Right.
As soon as they have to get beyond that, then it splinters, it unravels. And that's why you need a transitional phase. That's why, ideally, people like Omar Suleiman or others would be caretakers and give the Egyptians 6 months, a year and a half to sort it out, to set up a new constitution.
And, Mike, I've got to say, everybody that wants Mubarak to fall tomorrow, I'm talking about people in the West, saying, get out now. Give the people what they want now. The people do not know what they want right now. And I would suggest a transition, just like I'm sure, Richard, you agree with me. Dr. Brzezinski has said the same. Other foreign policy experts have said the same. We don't want this government to fall today. There is nothing to replace it.
Well, to buttress your point, I would imagine a leap into chaos right now could be truly catastrophic.
Right.
So my question to you is, at this moment in time, given what's coming out of Washington, given what we know what's going on in Egypt, who, if anyone, has leverage in this situation or has more leverage? Is it the Egyptian army? Is it Washington? Is it the pro-Mubarak forces? Or does leverage remain with the vast numbers of people in Alexandria and Cairo in the streets?
We have almost no leverage. Let's not kid ourselves. It's Mubarak, it's the army, it's the people in the street. And we know it's Mubarak against the people in the street. The army casts the deciding vote. That is the institution to watch.
All right, so here's what happened overnight. The military largely stood aside as the country's uprising did turn deadly, with rival protesters fighting gun battles on the streets. According to the Egyptian health minister, 5 people are dead, more than 800 injured in the violence, which first erupted early yesterday, actually live on this broadcast. Protesters are accusing Mubarak's regime of instigating the chaos by unleashing a force of paid thugs and police in plain clothes to crush the unprecedented movement. This morning, Mohammed el-Baradei and the Muslim Brotherhood reportedly rejected a call by the prime minister for talks, saying President Mubarak must leave office first. The State Department is continuing efforts to fly Americans out of Egypt, telling all remaining U.S. citizens who wish to depart on an American government flight to report to the airport immediately, and that further delay is not advisable. More than 1,900 Americans and their family members have been evacuated since Monday, and officials are boarding additional flights today. As the demonstrations dramatically escalate, the U.S. is renewing its call for President Mubarak to take steps toward democratic elections at once. The State Department's P.J. Crowley spoke about the urgency of change.
We are making clear, to Egypt publicly and privately what needs to be done. We're not prescribing, what Egypt needs to do. There has to be there's been a call for a transition. President Mubarak has committed to a transition, but now is the time where the government has to take meaningful, serious steps, concrete steps, to demonstrate that it is moving down a path to elections and to democratic governance in Egypt that responds to the aspirations of the Egyptian people.
Hillary Clinton also called Egypt's newly appointed vice president yesterday to urge the government to hold accountable those responsible for the violence. And at the White House, Robert Gibbs condemned the dramatic events.
The president's administration strongly condemned the outrageous and deplorable violence that's taking place on the streets of Cairo, that's taking place in the streets of Cairo today. We have said that throughout this process. Obviously, if any of the violence is instigated by the government, it should stop immediately. The people of Egypt need to see change. The people of Egypt need to see progress. And that's what the world needs to see. The people of Egypt, they do not want to see appointments. They do not want to see speeches. They want to see concrete action by their government. Again, I want to be clear. This is though we are in the here and now started yesterday. Again, I think that's what the people of Egypt want to see is not some process that starts a week, a month, or several months from now.
So you're not satisfied with September as an outdate for President
If you're
Mubarak?
asking me if now is September, it is unseasonably warm, but it is not September. Now means now.
Decode what Robert Gibbs just said on behalf of the White House.
What it seems to be saying is that the White House is rejecting the Mubarak plan that he'd step down in September. When Gibbs goes out there and says things have to have now concrete actions, it sounds like he wants Mubarak to step down now. I think that's the right position. What I think is a mistake is for the United States to articulate it publicly. We can't bring it about. We have very little influence here. And why do we want to insert ourselves in the middle of something that could unravel in the sense that we then take on all this extra or added responsibility for events in Egypt. I think we should basically shut down our public statements, privately behind the scene urge the army to try to bring about a rapid change in office. But I don't understand why we would be saying these public statements day in, day out.
What message does that send to Saudi Arabia, to Jordan, to others who have seen the United States treat Mubarak like one of their closest allies in the world? And suddenly when things turn badly, they throw him under a bus. And I'm not saying that it's not the moral and right thing to do. But let's be realistic about it. After this government falls, we're going to need friends in Saudi Arabia we can count on. We're going to need friends in Jordan we can count on. We're going to need friends across the world we can count on that don't have Jeffersonian democracies.
You're exactly right. But including Egypt. We still don't know how Egypt's going to play out. And what's going to make a difference is not what Robert Gibbs or anyone else says from the White House podium. What's going to happen on the streets of Egypt, what the army decides. It's quite possible that we're going to have the Mubarak government till the fall. And we're going to have to work with them. It's quite possible we're going to have a fairly unattractive successor government. We're going to have to work with them. We've got to be very careful. There's no mileage for us to take a big public role here. What matters is what we say in private.
Yeah. Are they trying to gain applause from human rights groups and
you keep hearing that, all the stuff, we've got to position ourselves on the right side of history. You keep hearing this kind of rhetoric or sloganeering. Mistake. Just stay quiet.
The less said, the better.
Less is more.
Let me ask you a question about the reality of this. It would seem, from what's happened over the past 10 days, that the ultimate card, maybe the only card we have to play within Egypt, is with the army, with the military. So what happens to that card in terms of strengthening it or weakening it with all the rhetoric coming out of Washington?
Doesn't help. Doesn't help. The Army's, look, it's the most important institution in Egypt. They're playing for the long haul. What's surprising to me is that the Army would risk its prestige and legitimacy to keep Mubarak in office for another 7 or 8 months. And that's why I didn't predict what happened yesterday. I wouldn't have thought it would have happened. I would have thought the Army would have put more of its weight behind a kind of an exodus sooner rather than later. But the only power we have with the Army, quite honestly, is persuasion. What American general might say to his Egyptian counterpart.
All right, and I want to talk to you about the significance of tomorrow and your concerns there. But first, the reverberations, the uprising that began in Tunisia and spread to Egypt is echoing across the Middle East, including one of the region's poorest countries, Yemen. Tens of thousands have filled the streets there for their own day of rage, demanding a change in government. The crowds want Yemen's president of 32 years, who recently announced he would not seek re-election, to step down immediately. Meanwhile, Jordan's new prime minister is vowing to carry out political and economic reforms. He took office yesterday after mass protests across that country. Syrian opposition groups are also using Facebook and Twitter sites to call for a day of rage protest in that country tomorrow. And other demonstrations have broken out in Sudan, Algeria, and Saudi Arabia. Where do you want to start?
Sudan.
I think there's a big difference, though, between the monarchies and the non-monarchies. I think the Jordans, the Saudi Arabians, and others, they're basically okay. There's a compact, if you will, between the populace and the leadership.
And by the way, speaking of Jordan, Jordan's king is pretty popular in his country, is he not?
Jordan's king, Morocco's king, the Saudis. I think in those, King Abdullah in Saudi Arabia, I think they're all fine.
The Syrians have a lot to worry about, though, don't they?
They do, but because also they're a minority regime. They always are. They always have been. But Syria is so wired, so buttoned down, very, very tough to. It's a real police state. I think you want to watch places like Yemen, possibly Libya. It's the places where you have non-monarchs who have been in for decades and decades and decades.
Joe, did you ever think, given your service in Congress, your knowledge of the intelligence committees in both the Senate and the House.
And I also read Willie's book.
And you read Willie's book on land
Studied
warfare,
it.
along with von Clausewitz, Willie Geist, that you'd ever hear the following countries and these two words connected: Yemen, Jordan, Syria, Facebook, Twitter. It is amazing.
And Saudi Arabia.
You
know, a couple of days ago I talked about my political science professor in the early 80s when we were all debating the Cruise 2 missiles being deployed to Western Europe, and we went on and on. She just raised her hand. She said, they're a lot more worried about the Xerox machine. That tells you how far we've come since the early 80s, because they didn't have Xerox machines in the Soviet Union that people could use to copy books. And now it's just exploded. You can't keep the genie in a bottle anymore.
It is amazing.
And it is spreading across the globe. Again, the question is, what's next?